Hello, welcome back for another Full Moon Sessions. I'm your host, Saul Muerte. And yes, you are indeed correct. This is the second of our Full Moon Sessions for this month. That's because we're hitting our blue moon. Yes, there's two full moons in the month of August. So what that means is you get twice the pleasure of myself and my colleague who's come back again to chat all things new in the realms of horror. And that's Watch It Wombats. Nick, welcome back.
Cheers, Paul. Good to be back, mate.
All good, man.
You
All
got
good.
my pleasure.
All good, my friend. All good. Okay, so look, those that are new to this, with I think this is like our third round out now, our third big full moon sessions, and the idea behind it is that we're going to talk about all the things that have been killer vibes, or killer buzz kind of films that we've been seeing over the last month that's come out. So that could be stuff that we've seen, on the big screen, small screen, or anywhere in between. But what we should start off with first and kick off with is a little Australian flick that's kind of, just a small Australian flick that's kind of doing some numbers at the moment. And that's technically it came out at the end of last month, but we weren't, neither of us had been in a position to have seen it. And that's the film called Talk to Me by those Raka brothers. Now, you only just caught this fairly recently from recall, so you're probably more fresh in the mind for this one, Nick. So I might knock this one straight over to you and say,
Yeah,
what was your initial reaction to it, and do you think it deserved the buzz that surrounded?
yeah, like, really fresh. Actually, I watched it last night, and it was
Really?
just me and a mate, and there were two couples in there as well. So it's very small, but yeah, like you say, considering the film's been out so long, and this was like what's today, Wednesday? It was a Tuesday night, so it
Yeah.
was still quite quiet. But yeah, I was away on holiday when it was released, and so I didn't, go to. I don't think we even had a screening up here in Brisbane. Um, but there was so much buzz about it, and I had mates on other blogs who were interviewing the guys. And yeah, everything was, just a real positive review from everyone. So I'm kind of glad I let the buzz die down a bit when I watched it last night. Had a
Sure.
chance to settle. Because I know one person who didn't like it. He said it was the most boring film he'd ever seen. I was talking about it today.
What?
A
Okay.
mate from a mate from Dead by Dawn wasn't a big fan. Um,
Okay.
and yeah, go check out his blog. He's got some good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, he does.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, it was great. It was amazing. It was very clever. It's the kind of film I said to my mate when we walked out. It's the kind of film that you wish you'd made. You almost get a bit jealous, a little bit,
Yeah, yeah.
full poppy syndrome, going, "Oh God, that's such a good idea. Wish I'd thought of that." And it's my favorite kind of film where it builds its own lore and builds its own rules. And then
Yes.
when something happens, you know what's going to happen in a good way. It's not like predictable. It kind of, holds your hand. To
Yeah.
to especially at the end, without spoiling it. There's a certain moment where you're like, oh, okay, I know this is going to happen because of this, and
Yes,
it reminded
absolutely.
me,
I know what you're referring to as well.
yeah,
And there was a point where actually when I was watching it and I kind of felt like it can only end one way. I kept kind of I don't know if you had the same reaction, but I was like, there's no way out of this, right?
mm.
It feels like it is going in one direction. Um,
Yeah. So
and
I didn't get that. For
oh,
me,
didn't you? See, I
no.
did, and I was just like, I felt like, oh, okay. But like I kept going, what's the out? What's going to be the out? Because there's always an out, right? There's always an
Mm.
out. Um, and so that's what kept me kind of pulling along with it, really, and I found that really interesting. Look, here's my prognosis that I wrote up for this Surgeons of Horror website. I said the Raka brothers have not only exceeded expectations but have produced a solid effort for their first feature-length outing, calling the shots from behind the camera. While arguably they have produced a fairly safe outing when it comes to narration, their captivating part comes through their strength in character, combined with Sophia Wilde's performance. Also, the blend of humor and horror peppered throughout helps to flip the juxtaposition of polarizing extremes to tie you to the chair, forcing you to grip the hand of darkness. Um,
Sounds good
I
to
really liked it. I
me.
thought it was good.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I thought like I felt to me it that's what made it compelling, the characters. And as I
Mm.
said, Sophia Wilde was amazing in it. Um and her support cast even. I thought there was a good round group of characters there that were engaging and kept you enthralled
Yeah,
throughout, and that's kind of what you want from a decent flick, right? So
yeah. It's the
yeah,
believability. Like, okay, these are characters, and you might not need to be in love with them, but you care enough for them that if one of them starts, doing something bad or getting hurt, you're like, oh no,
yeah,
that's not good. And especially with the cast of, I think it's fair to say, unknowns, pretty much,
yeah,
bar
yeah,
Miranda Otto, who this
yeah.
is the best thing I've seen her in. And
Yeah, actually, yeah, yeah. I thought she was great, and actually, she was also in Disney Plus did a series just recently called The Clearing.
yeah,
Um,
that one.
have you called it at all? Because
Yeah,
she's pretty compelling in that too, I found. So
yeah, I
yeah,
found that hard because she's playing that character of that real life person, so
yeah,
it just felt like a caricature, which
okay,
is what
sure,
that person's like, who she's portraying.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that was always going to be a hard job. Whereas this one was just sort of believable, and I think
yeah,
that's it. The whole movie's believable because it's written as kids talk. I've got a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, and most of the time that's how they talk,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
half the time that's how I talk to my kids as well. It's the same sort of response, and
That's
and
right.
that just grounded it so much that it was really good. But then it still had that lore, of the hand and what that meant and where it came from, and it's like,
Yes.
believable in that world. It's like, okay, cool, that's an interesting premise. I like that. I want to see where that's going to go.
Yeah.
And it reminds me, I don't know if you remember when you were younger. I don't think it wasn't that big, but people would like push mates up against the wall and breathe push the air out of their lungs and then
Yeah.
they'd
Yeah.
faint.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
felt like that sort of thing that, kids could
Yeah.
do that and
I
just,
felt like that's what I really felt like it. It's that kind of hook thing. Like there's a bit of that peer pressure wanting to fit in with people, and you will kind of go along with whatever it is, and you're pushing yourself to the limit, not really understanding the depths of danger that they are going through and
yeah,
about to experience. So yeah, I found it really 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 cool.
and beautifully
Um,
shot as well. It's
yeah.
the other end of the scale was with the Blair Witch Project, which was what it was, and on a minor budget too. But it had set up that premise again, where at the end you knew what was going to happen, but only because it told you what was going to happen.
Yeah.
With the person again, don't want to spoil the Blair Witch Project, but geez, guys, it's been a while if you haven't seen that. But still, I don't want to spoil that. But yeah, and I think it's just well written, well acted, well directed. Like couldn't really ask for more in a horror movie myself.
Definitely, definitely was very, very, very cool. All right, so I might be putting you on the spot here, and apologies, but
Go
the
for it,
other
mate.
movie that kind of came out right at the very end of last month, which we didn't get a chance to look at because we recorded prior to it, and that
Mhm.
was The Haunted Mansion, which
Oh
was
yeah.
Disney. Now I haven't seen this yet, but I know that you have. Would you like to add any thoughts or comments on that? I mean, I think we kind of semi were talking about how we believed that it was going to be maybe it might be a bit mediocre, lackluster affair, but ticking a few boxes here and there. Um, what was your general feel of it?
Yeah, pretty rough. I'd kind of built my own hype really around it because when it first was announced, I'm like, well, look, it's unnecessary. And then I
Yeah.
started talking to people, and then I started reminiscing about what the Haunted Mansion meant to me as a little kid. Like I
Yes.
went when I was about 8, and then I think when I was 10 to Florida Disney World, and an amazing experience. And I can still vividly remember going on all these rides and what we did. And the Haunted Mansion always stood out because I loved spooky stuff as a kid. And the lead up to the movie, oh, maybe they are actually going to capture this experience again, and I'm going to, go, oh, look, I remember that. And there were moments, and they were very, pretty obvious. But it started off okay, and it tried to, deviate from the original story, but it just spent the whole time going backwards and forwards in and out of the house,
Uh,
and it set up some rules which kind of make the whole thing a bit more believable, which was okay. And the acting was a bit off, and yeah, just boring. Really, it was a real,
yeah, that's
real
a shame.
shame.
Hey,
Yeah.
no, there was a pretty decent cast in there, though, wasn't there, from memory? Or am I?
Oh yeah, massive cast. When you hear like Danny DeVito being in
Yeah,
a
yeah.
Disney Haunted Mansion movie, you're like, oh cool, this could be fun. And he was more just a sort of background guy who he's pretty much slipped into his Always Sunny in Philadelphia to role as Frank.
Sure.
And, just being, the weird, obnoxious guy in the background didn't really contribute too much. And yeah, it was a massive cast. Like Owen Wilson was a bit weird of a choice, just being Owen Wilson. Like no one really shifted out of that gear. So look, I'd say if you're a massive Disney fan and love the rides, go for it, tick off the box. But as much as I encourage people to go to the cinema, this could definitely wait for Disney Plus in maybe a couple of months or something. So yeah,
all right,
no
cool.
that one.
Well,
But
no,
yeah.
thanks for that, because as I said, I haven't checked it out, and I probably will anyway, regardless, despite our both having, I felt like, those same apprehensions going in. Now the other one that just came out at the beginning of the month, which I haven't written up a review for yet, and I hadn't checked with you prior to record of whether or not you caught it, but that was Meg 2, The Trench.
Oh, yeah.
Have you caught that yet or no?
No, it's been on my list,
Yeah.
and I know my 13-year-old saw it and loved it.
Okay, that
So
may make sense to me. Yes.
yeah, and I think if you're gonna, you know what you're getting into with Meg 2. It's that same old thing. It's looks like there's nothing new. I think you've seen most of it in the trailer.
Yeah.
But I think, if you're just going with just to enjoy yourself, maybe a beer beforehand, have some popcorn,
Yeah.
enjoy it with your mates. Don't expect Ben-Hur, and you'll be fine, I reckon.
You've hit the nail on the head, mate. Absolutely. Like, I remember going to see the first one with Ant, one of our other fellow surgeons who comes on board and chats with us semi regularly. And yeah, and it was laughable, right, but enjoyable. And this one does treads a very similar line. It's Jason Statham being Jason Statham. And the ridiculous lengths they get to in there's one point, and well, it's not really a spoiler, but it's like what I'm going to say is jousting on a jet ski. And when that moment comes around on a film, then hopefully you'll understand what I'm referring to, Nick, when you do
I
come and
think I've
watch
seen
it.
that in the trailer too. Like I've tried to avoid the trailer,
It's
but
hilarious, absolutely hilarious.
Yeah.
And it was that point I just went, yep, we're definitely in this movie for hook, line, and sinker. Cool.
They just
But
on
yeah,
that
I will
note,
still write up a review at some point over in the next coming days. So keep an eye out for that. And if you have any thoughts out there on it, if you've caught it, please let us know. All right, but and that film was very much action centered, right, as well. So moving more into, I guess, the horror realm, was a film that came out also just early on in the month of August, and that was Dracula: Voyage of the Demeter. Now I'll start things off with this one too, because I'll read my prognosis that I had hit up on our website. I basically said there is plenty of intrigue from a fairly untapped segment in one of Gothic literature's finest tales, one that would pull me into the arena with willing anticipation. Yet, for all the talent on screen, there is surprisingly little in the way of building up the ambience and dread from someone as fearful as Dracula. So focused are the writers in embellishing the plot with background and character development, some with a license that creatives can afford to keep the audience captivated, that they neglect to draw out the fear and trepidation that the Prince of Darkness deserves. While the journey is still an enjoyable one, the course is easily traversed and never delves into the realms of immorality in order to stir the senses or shake you to the core. In a nutshell, what I'm saying there is it was a bit lackluster. And have you caught it at all, Nick? Have you caught it?
Yeah, I went to a screening, and it was, I agree with your review. It was very except probably not as articulately. It was just a bit flat. Like the characters, they had backstory, which is fine, but wasn't really too bothered. Just the cast just didn't really interest me much, and the kid was really annoying for me. I'm not bagging him out. I'm sure he's a lovely kid, and I'm sure he can be a great actor. But in this, it just was, maybe it's the way it was directed just felt annoying. And I know that was part of his character as well. Like he's the little ship's kid, but it's like there's the way of doing that in which he can be the cheeky kid that you sort of care about.
Yeah, I get what you mean, but interestingly, I actually found the kid quite interesting, but I agree with you that it could have been directed slightly differently. And it's hard to not talk about what I want to talk about with the spoiler bit, but there's a decision in the film they make
Mm.
which involves that kid that I go, I actually glad you did that. It was probably the one thing where I went, you chose to go there.
Yeah, I think I know what you
It's
mean.
hard. I'm skirting around it because I
I know
don't
what you
want to
mean.
give it away in case anyone's not seen it.
Yeah, yeah.
But I kind of went, oh, okay.
Mm.
But for the rest of it, yeah, I found it pretty mediocre, as I said, and like he wasn't scary. Like Dracula was not scary at all, which
No.
I find really odd because I've forgotten the name of the director, but he's the same guy that did the autopsy of Jane Doe.
Oh yeah.
And that's a confined space too, right? It's in a mortuary
Mm.
with Brian Cox, not Professor Brian Cox, but the actor Brian Cox,
Yeah.
right? And the other kid, Emil Hirsch, I want to say.
Oh
Oh,
yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah,
kind of saying it
yeah.
off the top of my head. I think it's those two. They're like the main two. Like
Mm.
there are other characters, but they're minor. It's mainly two characters overnight in a mortician's place.
Yeah.
Um, and it's quite tense, and there's a lot of build up through it, and it was quite a good film. So I felt like, oh, okay, you're kind of doing the same thing, but you're on a ship. So maybe if someone's going to pull it off and make it build up ambience and make things quite tense filled, um, then he could do the job. But yeah, felt like he didn't do it. So I was kind of like, okay.
Yeah.
So
I
a little
think
bit miffed, I would say.
so. I was going to say the problem I have with films like that is I struggle with films with the inevitability of it all.
Yes,
You sort
yes.
of like it doesn't have to be linear storytelling all the time, but sometimes when it's like, okay, people can survive, or it could be a flashback or
Yeah,
things like
yeah,
that. It's just like, well, you're just waiting for stuff to play out, and I don't want to do that.
yeah,
You know, I want to guess and think about what's going to happen, and be surprised.
yeah.
And
And
yeah,
even the ending, like again, I can't talk about it too much in case people haven't seen it. But even the ending, the choice of the ending made me go, right, are you choosing to deviate away from the novel now? Um,
mm,
that was puzzling to me. But anyway,
yeah,
those were like kind of like my where I end up leaving with things with that. All right, so the next movie I'm going to talk about, which I'm going to guess that you haven't seen, Nick, purely because it was on Shudder's one of Shudder's releases, and it was a film called Bad Things. Now I basically it came out about mid-August. My prognosis here said the elements embedded in Bad Things are a clear homage to The Shining, but where Stanley Kubrick embarked in a deeply psychological and traumatic narrative, helmed by the depth of character that Jack Torrance embodied and wonderfully portrayed by Jack Nicholson, the realms of insanity on display here are thwarted by a shallow interpretation of persona. Stuart Thorndike does attempt to steer the inspiration into a new direction with an avenue of intrigue and entropy, but her characters are already lost at the start and without hope of resolving their internal conflict. In a nutshell, the movie has four female characters within it. They set up or take over the business of running this remote hotel from one of the main girls' grandmothers who's passed away. But there's question marks over the psychological how settled some of the characters are within it. So it kind of leads to a lot of these visions that are happening that are ghostly, or are they not ghostly? Are they in the characters' minds and that? So like the premise is good. Like, and you can, like I said, there's a lot of The Shining embedded in there. But yeah, like from the get-go, we're just not invested in the characters. We're meeting them headlong into damage control. So we
mm,
haven't had that journey with them or built anything up. You just kind of go, all right, and I'm rooting for you because yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, it was a bit woeful, let's just say.
yeah. Fair enough.
Okay, and the next one was another on-demand release. I don't even remember this getting a cinematic release, but it is available on most home entertainment distributors as well. And it's a film that was called Malum.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was wondering about that one.
Yeah, so this one here, I'm just trying to find the director's name because I've only got his surname written down there. Anthony de Blasi, that's it, thank you. So Anthony de Blasi is the guy behind it. Now, my prognosis for this was de Blasi does well to carve out a warped world within the confines of an isolated space. Jessica Siula does well to portray the victimized protagonist, which is essential as the narrative rests solely on her shoulders. There are, however, too many questions left unanswered, and you can't help but feel that the more time could have been invested in the universe to draw out the tense riddled paranoia instead of the few jump scares that we're provided with. Yes, there are some strange occurrences that lay groundwork into the atmosphere that has been generated, but considering Malum is a reworking of one of de Blasi's previous features called Last Shift, you'd think that he would have been able to develop something a little more intrinsic and with a little bit more depth. Now, I'm guessing you haven't seen this one either.
No, it's been on my list just because of the poster, and I've been meaning to get around to it. But Last Shift, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, that kind of, I want to say it came out in like 2014 or something like that. So it's only like about,
Mm.
I don't know, I could be completely wrong in my statement there, but it's not that old anyway. And so he's revisiting this story, or so he's obviously invested in it, right? He obviously wants to go back into that world. And I kind of get it because it is quite rich. There are some interesting things on play here. So it's not that I'm damning the film per se, um, because coming into it, there is a shocking moment at the very beginning too, which will hook you in. And then again, playing with the paranoia stuff again, like is stuff really happening? And it's all set around the occult as well, and there's this almost like Charles Manson-esque kind of approach to it as well. So there's some interesting, quirky, weird shit going on, but it kind of doesn't ever sink in enough. And I guess that's my point with, like, if you've already done this story and you're coming back to it to kind of try it again, it makes me wonder. I haven't seen Last Shift, so I can't comment on that, but
Mm.
it makes you go, well, what was Last Shift like then? Surely that's a bit of a turd fest. If you're coming out with this, because the film's okay, like Malum's all right. It's okay, an okay film. It just doesn't resonate, doesn't go deep enough. I say all that, but I really I like Jessica Siola's performance in it. I thought she has to carry the film, and I think she does. So, and I think that's part of what keeps you invested in her journey to its conclusion. So I wouldn't say don't watch it, but it's just, yeah, just didn't quite grip me enough. Now, all of this doesn't bode too well for the month of August because I feel like we've plateaued in most of these films. They haven't really kind of really hit their mark too much. Next two movies that I'm just going to wrap things up with that were released on demand similarly hit that kind of flat note area. But the first of those was a film called Wolfkin. Now, this may kind of get you sitting up and paying attention because, as the name suggests, it's a film about lycanthropy, and it does do something with a new angle to it too, which I thought was quite interesting and fresh. Here's my prognosis. I said, whilst Wolfkin does boast some decent practical effects, this is a slow burn story that does little when it tries to finally ignite. Where Let the Right One In and The Hatching, both movies which I have taken a like to in their promotions, they have depth and tension to fill that void. Wolfkin simmers along with plenty to say, but has little impact in the way that it's presented. Hats off to the director Molitor, though, for attempting to take an age-old tale into a new direction, but it ultimately lacked enough. But okay, I'm laughing at myself because there's a pun here. Sorry, it lacked enough bite to sink your teeth into.
There you go.
So it's Wolfkin is available on DVD and digital platforms now. So if you do want to check it out, but essentially the crux of the story is that it starts off with like a bang fest in the middle of a forest with this wife and this guy hooking up, full on naked romp as you do, and then he fucks off, and you just go, yeah, that's typical for a bloke. Have a root and then fucks off, right? And then we cut to like, I want to say 8 or so years later, and she's obviously had a baby. And this is where the title Wolfkin comes in, because the baby, as he's growing up and becoming as he's developing, there are some unusual symptoms that start occurring with wolf-like tendencies. So this is why I felt it's quite interesting, because we're looking at things from the youth perspective, the young kind of journey up, and what that means, and with the mother who dotes after her son, as she would, with that kind of mother-son kinship connection. But yeah, she's dealing with this traumatic episode. So lots of promise, but it's a bit of a wank fest when you're watching it. It's got one of those kind of like, it's trying to be highbrow throughout, right? So that's what I meant by it's a slow burn. You're kind of sitting there going, all right, get to the point. So it kind of is a bit of a hard watch because of that, unfortunately. The other one is another Shudder release. It was called The Communion Girl. And here is my prognosis of this one. It's a Spanish film by director Victor Garcia, who is no stranger to the horror genre, having worked on Mirrors 2 and Hellraiser Revelations. And he weaves his craft with delight in this latest venture. Carla Campra also captivates on screen as the final girl, but as the narrative unfolds, it becomes apparent that the Communion Girl borrows heavily from other successful features, such as Ringu or folktales like The Curse of the Weeping Woman. We know that the vengeful spirit has a vendetta that needs to be brought to a satisfying conclusion, and so we walk familiar terrain to get there. Despite this, though, the feature does still entertain and offers a slight twist in the tale, albeit a slightly confusing one at the end. So yeah, another kind of mediocre one, but I reckon it bubbled just around the average kind of viewing point for me. But yeah, do check these out, any of these films that we've been discussing, and let us know your thoughts on them. So before we get into, or before we wrap up our Killer Vibes section of all things that happen in August, we also have a quick look at some of the films that were what I call the retrospectives, films that turned of age over the last month. The first one, and I probably feel like you might have a few things to say about this one, but the first one I've got on my list here is Cujo, which turned 40 goddamn years old this year. So I'm guessing you've seen Cujo. Any thoughts on that film, Nick? And if anyone hasn't seen it out there, as crazy it may seem, would you recommend it still in as a modern viewing audience?
Yeah, look, I hadn't seen it in a little while, like a fair while. I remember watching it as quite a young kid, and it was pretty terrifying. Partly because one of my best mates growing up, he had a neighbor a few doors down, and they had this fence, and you couldn't really see it, but you could hear it. It was like this massive sort of chicken wire cage that they kept this Rottweiler in.
Oh, God. Okay, yeah.
And so you'd go past out the back. So it was like a communal garage area with like rows of garages, like back here. I don't know if you have them so much over here, but in Britain you have them, and the houses all share them and stuff. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Every time I went to get the bikes out the back, you'd have to hear the dog woof, woof, woof all the time. So, and you'd see it occasionally getting. You'd never even really see it. That was the creepy part.
Yeah, that's probably
And
what
so,
it is. It's that.
having
Bark
a movie
right.
based around that was pretty mad, because you just the size of it and the sheer scale of it, and it would cut to a real dog most of the time, but I don't think it would hold up well because of the sort of animatronic dog or the puppet that would sort of just come in and go, like some guy around the neck. Like I can picture those visuals now and go,
that's right.
I don't think
I had watched it semi recently, and for those that aren't familiar or are wanting to follow some of my thoughts, not only on Surgeons of Horror, but I've also got a letterbox thing. So, and I've got a list up there for which I call retrospectives, and it's looking at all these films. So some of the films that we'll be discussing today are part of that, and it's my aim to try and watch all of those throughout the course of this year. And Cujo was in there, so I did watch it, but it was earlier on in the year. And you're right, it doesn't, like, it's hard though, because like, again, it's like a very isolated situation. I mean, builds up a long build up, because the dog's got to get rabid, and you've got to explain how it's gotten rabid. in the first place, and then get to that final bit where Dee Wallace is with the son trapped in the car, and have that reason for them being stuck and trapped in the car and why
Yeah,
they can't get out.
that's what I remember. When you said
Yeah,
Cujo, that's
yeah.
what I thought of that scene. And then a fence, but then now I'm thinking of of the Sandlot kids. So then,
Yeah, sure. And it does make Beethoven hard watching though. Next, if you
yeah,
ever catch that again with the Saint Bernard dog,
yeah,
you kind of go, I don't know if I really want Saint Bernard looking after me anymore.
mm,
But yeah, anyway, look, that one turned of age. Stephen King, obviously, we didn't mention, was the guy that had originally written the book that the film was based on, and we all know about his legend when it comes to both literary and on-screen presence that he and impact he's had over the years. The next one was a 20-year-old film that came out, as I said, 20 years ago. Freddy versus Jason. I can't believe that's 20 years ago.
yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy, but it was. So that turned 20. Now, I did rewatch this again, and it is cheese on toast. But then you, what are you going to expect when you get these two heavyweight serial killers coming
Mm.
together? Have you called it at all, Nick, or is this one of the ones that kind of just blip past you?
I watched it when it first came out,
Yeah, yeah.
and
I think I did the
I
same.
have no. I just straight away think of like Jason in space. What was it, Jason X? That's when you start entering that
Yeah,
territory. It
yeah.
gets a bit fast and furious, with all the sequels and everything. And
Yep.
and I just don't remember a single thing about that movie. Maybe the poster, and that's about it. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
does
Yeah.
Jason start dreaming and Freddy jumps in? Like,
100%. And that's the thing. Like when I often when I finish watching them, I sometimes or like when it's around the time I post a few images on Instagram and stuff of the film, but they're all like when I was trying to look for images, they're all very similar, right? I'm just like that's not that says a lot about what the film is.
yeah,
So but it is what it is, and you got two heavyweight kind of 1980s serial killers matching up against each other, which is going to tick some boxes for a few fans out there. And incidentally, and I know you're aware of this, Nick, but I'm hoping to put something out there in one of these segments down the track for this current full moon sessions, looking at what makes an iconic serial killer. So keep an ear out for that too, because the focus on that though, and the reason behind that was more to do with Leatherface, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre also had a big one with celebrating 50 years just recently as well.
wow.
Massive one. And if you want to get our thoughts on that, you can actually hear yours truly and Mr. Nick from Watch It Wombat discussing that
We did
way
as
back
well.
a few years ago now over on our Surgeons of Horror podcast. So yeah, go
Yeah.
check it out, man. I might put the link on one on our YouTube chat down here. Okay, the other one that came out was a film called Black Sabbath. Now this is one of a couple of Mario Bava films that came out, alternatively known as the Master of the Macabre, for all his Italian. I'm not talking about Black Sabbath, the the band. It's the film called Black Sabbath, which was from memory, I think it was like an anthology, and it had 3 segments to it, and it starred Boris Karloff as the one person that linked the 3 stories together. Again, like look, I love Mario Bava, and I feel like I prefer more his Giallo films that he did. But what you can guarantee is that his films are beautifully shot. The cinematography are always amazing. So for that alone, this film is great. But I found the stories themselves kind of a little bit hit and miss as you journeyed through it. And I'm just kind of looking back now because I can't remember. Yeah, so that was 60 years that was released. So back in
Yes.
1963, that film came out. And then we moved to Westworld. Now, people may know this more from the recent series that had come out. But the original film, 50 years old, came out back in 1973. And yes, this one has a bit more of a sci-fi kind of cowboy bent, but there are horror elements in the way when Yul Brynner's black cowboy character then starts to rise up against the human regime, and killing people on site. I find it really weird watching this film back. I did watch it again, and I always love now I always get his name wrong because I always confuse his son and his name because they're both J Brolins. So it's
Gotcha.
James Brolin. I want to say
James Brolin,
Josh is the
yeah,
son, right?
dad,
I
yeah.
always flip them in my head.
Yeah,
But James Brolin, I think, is always amazing. He's always got that killer stare, and I always
yeah.
think of him in the original Amityville Horror as well. Um, but yeah, like it's great. But I can't help watching the original film without thinking of Itchy and Scratchy from The Simpsons now. When they go to Itchy and Scratchy World and all the
World,
robots,
yeah,
and I just
yeah,
I find it really hard.
yeah.
But yeah, it's still a cool film, and that turned 50. And another big film, which was a massive film for Marvel, was Blade. That was released
So good.
25 years ago, celebrating its silver anniversary.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and watching that again, it's got some laughable elements. I always remember this. It's the bit at the end where they blow up like balloons, like the vampires are blowing up like raspberry balloon things, and you're thinking of Willy Wonka and Violet Beauregard kind of moments,
Yeah.
right?
Or Big Trouble in Little China with
Yeah,
the
yeah, that too.
yeah.
But Wesley Snipes does kick ass in it, and he did set off a very important film for Marvel, because without Blade, the rest wouldn't have come that we've all come to love with all of the Iron Man films and Avengers stuff, because they had to prove that they could market a successful comic film, and Blade
Mhm.
did that.
Yeah, because Spawn wasn't really the success they wanted. I know obviously
Exactly
different
right.
company, but
Yeah.
the premise of making the leap to the big screen was a tough sell, I reckon.
It was. It really was. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, there's two more retrospectives to talk about. One of them I absolutely adore, and that was in 1963. It got released, and it was called The Haunting, which was based on Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill
So
House.
good.
Most people nowadays would probably know that title from Mike Flanagan's series adaptation that got released on Netflix, The Haunting of Hill House. Now, but the original the original flick in 1963 is amazing. Now, I had a friend actually kind of say he watched it semi recently, and he found it a little bit tired, and found it
Mm.
hard to connect with. But there are, to me, and I am a bit of a lover of old school horror, so maybe it just speaks to my heart a bit. But I found that it's interesting because at the time it was released, it had a lot of mixed reviews. But I feel like it's a film that's has been treated kindly over the years, and it still resonates now. It has a way of capturing a lot of that kind of well, there's a couple of things going on there. Go check out my article for a bit more, but in a nutshell, I basically was saying there's a couple of elements to make this film work really well. One of them is the screenwriter called Nelson Gidding. When he read the book, he actually didn't read it as a ghost story. He felt that it was about a woman having a breakdown, a mental breakdown in a house. And so when he first wrote the script, that's how he wrote it. And then
Right.
when he and the director, Robert Wise, went and had a chat with Shirley Jackson about it to talk about this is what they're making, and they quizzed her about it, she said, no, it's a ghost story. So they had to retweak it a little bit. And I think the end result is this great blend of two, because yes, it's a ghost story, but you keep questioning the lead character's breakdown through it.
Mm.
Like, because she's isolated, she's stripped back from her world, and she's yearning to connect, and that's what lures her in, and why she ends up getting possessed by the house, because the house wants her. She wants something, and the house goes, great, I'm gonna have you. Now, the other cool thing about it is that Julie Harris is the lead in this film, and she was going through a massive depression, and she went on record talking about it at the time. And so she was equally struggling to connect with the world around her, and you see a lot of that happening in this performance. And even with the other actors in the film, she deliberately pulled herself away from it, and equally isolating her. And this is what is portrayed in the film, in a way. And then the third thing and this is more of a technical component, but Wise and his cinematographer Davis Boulton had acquired an untested and warped 30 mm anamorphic wide angle lens from Panavision's camera. It was untested, and as such, there was a bit of a distortion in the lens. And they kind of did say to them, look, this, you need to go on record and need to sign this thing saying, you know, that this is not perfect. Now, the result of that is some of the visual components that we've seen, that there is a bit of a distortion effect that's going on, which makes this unfeeling of unsettlement as you're watching it. So those three components, I feel, make this quite a captivating film. There are other elements too in the mix, but I feel like I put those three as like the little cherries on the top as to why I feel like the film still resonates today.
Yeah,
I talked a hell of a lot about that. Sorry, as you can tell, I really love the film. But Nick, did you have any thoughts before I just talk about the last one?
yeah, I really loved that film too because it was. I can't remember why I started watching it. Obviously, a little while ago too, and yeah, just it's. I think it's got a really solid ending as well, and just the whole premise. And I've always loved sort of spooky house movies when they're done well, and it was just yeah, really entertaining because I liked all the different people and everything they had to say. And then unfortunately they remade it back in '99
Yeah, they
with
did.
yeah,
Liam
with Liam
Neeson.
Neeson and Owen Wilson and Catherine
Release the
Zeta-Jones.
Kraken.
Oh,
Yeah, so
yeah,
yeah, Liam Neeson. Yeah, and Lily Taylor is the lead in that one too, and Catherine Zeta-Jones is the other female
yeah,
character. Um, yeah, the less said about that one, the better.
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
but thankfully, like I said, we've got Mike Flanagan's own very, like, he goes off the central premise of what the film, the story is about, but he
Yeah,
heavily leans into the mystery behind the house itself.
yeah.
So do check that out as well if you haven't seen either of those. Now,
Is it nice?
the last retrospective again is another Mario Bava film. Yes, he released two films in 1 month. This one was called The Whip and the Body. As I said, it was released in 1963, and it was kind of like he had a killer year actually. So there was obviously the previous one I mentioned, Black Sabbath, but right at the very beginning of the year he had another film which was a giallo flick, which I think is amazing, and it's called The Girl Who Knew Too Much. So do check that one out.
Yeah,
Awesome film. But when it comes to The Whip and the Body, it stars the late great Sir Christopher Lee in it too. So in one of his earlier performances, and yes, he's filming it, as you can imagine, in Italy, where the film is set, and it's it was highly so when it was released in Italy, it got heavily hit by the Italian censorship board because there's a lot of themes around sadomasochism in it, which proved uncomfortable viewing for some. So what actually got released was quite a cut down version. Now, since then, elements of that film has been kind of knitted back together, and you can see that in the DVD Blu-ray releases. But it is a bit of a convoluted film when you watch it back. I hadn't seen it before, so I was coming on it fresh from my retrospective viewing. But when you come back and see it, and watch it, it's got a bit of it's quite a hard narrative to follow because essentially it's Christopher Lee's in the beginning, and he's this sadomasochist guy, and he he drives his lover to commit suicide, um, and then he ends up being murdered, and
right.
then a few years later, strange happenings are occurring, and people, the locals, are led to believe that his spirit has come back for revenge because murders start happening. So it's a bit hard to get your head around that, and the journey itself is a weird one, and one that I didn't really connect massively with. So I found like, yes, Mario Bava hit 3 films out, but I felt like the first film of the year, as I said, The Girl Who Knew Too Much, was the one that what really sat with me. Now, having said that, The Whip and the Body actually has quite a big cult following, so there will be some people that might kind of be chomping a bit to argue against me about why they think it's so good. I will once again say that Mario Bava, along with his cinematographer, know how to shoot a beautiful film, and this is no exception. Again, it's really, there's some beautiful images in there. So yeah, as I said, that rounds out our retrospective. Looking back, there was quite a few in there this time round, but some interesting ones in there. If any of them are films that you absolutely adored out there, if you're watching us, let us know and your thoughts on them. And do you think any of them deserved higher praise, or were some of them didn't deserve that praise and you thought they were big shining turds? Do let us know, because we're always interested in having that chat online through our social media platforms. Now we're going to wrap up there, for this is the end of our first segment, which we're calling our Killer Vibes, where we've talked about all things in August. Do stick around for our next couple of segments down the track. At the end, we're going to come back and talk about fresh kills. So we will be talking about some things that are on the horizon in September that we're looking forward to, and we're calling that fresh kills. But sandwiched in between that, we'll have another segment too, where Nick and I are going to post a couple of hidden gems that were released over the years, that we believe warrants another viewing, and we're going to have a quick chat about how we believe those films sit today and why we think you should see them. Stick around until then. Look out for our next couple of sections. As always, I'm your host, Saul Muerte, and thanks. Watch it, Wombats, Nick.
Pleasure, mate, as always.